Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 50 of Series 9. The question for today is, what are values? Are they objective, subjective, or just indications of absence? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 3. It may seem mistaken to give a definition of value and valuing at the end of this series on various expressions of value. But we have already had a working understanding of what value is and how it works in daily life. And the preceding workshops have also been providing an ostensive definition of value. Not only that, I have also presented a principle of value in response to questions of life. So we must now provide a more explicit and detailed definition of value. More so because, despite its wide use, the concept of value has been a subject to neglect and misunderstanding. For example, value is an essential element in religion, but religion typically has no concept or theory of value. So to do so would plunge religion into an explicit understanding that would undermine religious reality. The neglect of the concept of value in religion is revealed by the fact that Cruden's 800-page biblical concordance records 10 instances of the word, and then only as a verb or an adjective. That is, as an action or describing worth, but not yet conceived as a noun, concept, or a subjective state. This neglect is related to another misunderstanding of value as an abstraction rather than a collective noun. That is, value exists as a general category consisting of different values like wanting and magnanimity. And the realization that different values form a category of value can be a transformative insight. For example, realizing that nuts, bolts, and rivets are all fasteners is an insight for a non-engineer. And with respect to value, even today, many ways of conceiving value remain inadequate. One of these ways of defining values is just by their applications in superficial classifications. For example, as ethical, economic, aesthetic, family, religious, and scientific values. But these are all applications and classifications that are not definitions of value itself. Another elementary misconception is to regard values as synonyms for good or for things that are good. But this greatly restricts the meaning of value and omits negative values like hatred or resentment. With respect to definition, functionality defines different kinds or types of value in terms of what they do. Viktor Kraft of the Vienna Circle, for example, classifies values as being about morality, aesthetics, or utility. But we can also talk about perspectival, motivational, and experiential values. Perspectival values apply to points of view, bias, and value-laden facts, and might be described as cognitive values. The term perspectival values is widely used by philosophers such as Bernard Williams and Thomas Nagel. Motivational values can include volitional and moral values of reasons for action and ethical principles. Moral values are recognized as a particular kind of value, but might only be applications of value. And experiential or affective values are those like love, hate, desire, guilt, shame, disgust, and pity. But experiential values aren't often described as such, and even less frequently as affective values. A third way of defining values is to distinguish them as objects, adjectives, actions, or subjective experiences. Objects are either attributed with value or regarded as having intrinsic value, to be discussed shortly. And values might also be attributed to, intrinsic to objects, or supervenient on objects. The meaning of supervenience is when something is a necessary property of an object. Another distinction is between intrinsic values and ends in themselves. For example, I hold that happiness is an end in itself, but not an intrinsic value. Also, when objects are attributed with value, then that value is adjectival or descriptive. And again, all these objects can be material or abstract principles or even mental objects or states. Examples of objects that are taken to be values are truth, justice, money, happiness, excellence, God, and beauty. But these leave out negative values like hate, deception, resentment, and death that we must include. These negative values also refute the above noted mistake of taking value as a synonym for good. A second misunderstanding of values is as activities or mental processes, sometimes described as verbs or adverbial. Examples of values as actions or processes are like liking, wanting, loving, and hating. This distinction can be described as one between values and valuing. Yet some values are mental states that I call value states, to be discussed shortly. Examples of value states are moral fortitude, love, hate, and self-esteem. But going further than all these ways of defining value, I believe that values should be defined explicitly. That is, I argue that values are essentially subjective and must be defined with internal features and criteria. These features include such as subjectivity or objectivity, valence, intentionality, volition, and phenomenality, as well as non-transferability, qualia, substantiality, object involvement, and quantifiability. That's quite a lot, but value is a complex idea. With respect to the unquantifiability of moral values, giving $100 isn't 10 times more moral than given $10. And aesthetic values are unquantifiable because, for example, beauty can't be assessed in mathematical multiples. Some other interesting features of value are selection, choice, and preference. Yet these examples of different kinds of value illustrate a known problem of the diversity of values. That is, many different states or objects may be masquerading as one concept, namely value. And I want to illustrate this problem with a discussion of the subjectivity or objectivity of value. In order to introduce this particular discussion, I want to talk about another class of values that I'm skeptical about. Examples of these are truth values, numeric values, monetary values, and values of quantity. My concern is that these values don't have the subjective experiential content essential to values. And on this view, these values can only seem to be describable as values analogously. That is, they are described as values, but should be described as properties or quantities, or we could call them pseudo-values. There are many examples of words with two meanings, but such ambiguity of meaning is usually understood. One example can be found in a joke about Singapore. someone asks, "What do you think about Singapore?" They answer, "Fine, fine, fine, fine." The word fine here stands for both a compliment and a penalty. In the case of monetary value, an item might be designated with a value of $5. But what does this mean? Ralph Perry argued that values don't exist until someone desires something, and I agree with him. So on this view, the item might be labelled as having $5 by a computer without anyone knowing. And because no one experiences that value by valuing it or by purchasing the item, its description of value is of a radically different kind to the experiential value that I discuss here. Moreover, I believe that describing such as value is not only misleading but erroneous. So that's why truth values, numeric values, and monetary values shouldn't be called values. Alternatively, these pseudo values could be described as value rated objects. Another consequence of Perry's view is that value can't be transferred between different contexts or situations. Using the language of economics, we could say that value isn't fungible or it's not transferable. A practical example is the value of water to someone dying of thirst. But water is of less value in circumstances where water is in abundance. The social scientist Tristan Engelhardt fails to see this in his view that knowledge is always value laden because it involves the cost of acquiring it. Here the costs of acquiring knowledge are fallaciously transferred to knowledge in general. My final example of this fallacy of transferring value is shown in the idea of survival or of conscious existence. That is, we must survive to be conscious in order to have values. But these preconditions do not automatically give priority to the values in the context of consciousness. And this is evident in cases where personal survival is relegated for some other value. These views are endorsed by a subjective theory of value as Perry's and by John Mackie's celebrated argument. Mackie argues that there are no objective values in the fabric of the world and therefore no intrinsic values. His arguments are about psychological propensities and the queerness of quasi-objective entities. I previously discussed this argument, so I won't go over it again in detail here, but it's important to understand what he means. That is, in Mackie's argument, the word objective refers to substantive ontological existence, not universality. So here the rejection of objective values doesn't preclude the existence of normative ethical values. I agree with Mackie, but on the grounds that values can't exist independently without a conscious human agent. Yet there are other problems with the idea of what must be pre-existing objective values. They must be infinite in number and meaning to cater to human complexity and unlimited possibility. And why should our subjective commitments concur with these objective injunctions? Yet I'm explaining here the subjectivity of value, not arguing against objective value. To that end, some challenges to Mackie's arguments are such of as Dworkin, Grayling, Nagel and McDowell. 1. John McDowell points to the dependence of aesthetic value on the cognition of external objects. 2. The phenomenon of revealed values might suggest that values exist prior to being revealed. And 3. The existence of intrinsic values in the world would also challenge Mackie's argument. But both Perry's and Mackie's arguments against objective values also hold against intrinsic values. And I will soon argue that the only candidates of intrinsic values are subjective mental states and people. Yet we shouldn't discount the mythological significance of objectivity or universality in an analysis of value. It is with such ideas as objectivity, truth, or God that value can acquire its power and attraction. It's perhaps for such a reason why many religious and philosophical thinkers appeal explicitly to objective value. Such thinkers include Iris Murdoch, Susan Wolfe, Robert Nozick, and Ronald Dworkin. And Plato located values and ideas in a parallel but eternal and perfect realm. But how can we explain such belief in objective values? Is such thinking mistaken or confused? I think so. Claims that values are objective are common, but it isn't commonly agreed as to what objectivity means. Mackie's meaning above is of entities having substantive, ontological, mind-independent existence. Another meaning is just as an affirmation, avowal, like values are good or Jesus is Lord. This kind of meaning isn't theoretically useful, but we need to know that it is widely used. A third kind of meaning of objectivity employs a realist conception of values as what they really are. But this view presupposes both realism and that we know what kind of things that values are. A fourth meaning is about values as principles and having universality. I won't discuss problems of this view like, is it the formal or material content that is universal? How can universality accommodate diversity and relativity? And how can fixed pre-existent values have mandatory motivational power? A fifth meaning is that values are necessarily supervenient upon certain objects, events or actions. But those necessary relations have not been established and will probably never be established. A sixth meaning of objectivity is of inescapability, which offers a possibility for supervenience. Yet inescapability also introduces the idea of values brought into existence by structures of consciousness. This is the view that I favour, that resolves major problems, but I can't explain this here. Such invention rather than creation of values also presents a seventh meaning of objectivity as normativity. By normativity I mean giving order and direction, not fixed material content of values as often thought. Neither is this form of normativity a social normativity of consensus or agreement. This is how Ray Jackendoff below describes an eighth meaning of objective values, and I won't comment on the trivial ninth meaning of objectivity, simply that values exist. Yet Jackendoff seems to admit to this implied confusion by describing his account as the peculiar logic of value. He cites three features of value. 1. Valence as magnitude or intensity. 2. Different types or kinds of value. And 3. Subjectivity or objectivity, but he defines objectivity simply as shared or generic values. The idea that values have valence, magnitude or intensity may seem obvious, but Bernard Williams holds that many moral notions show a notable resistance to reflecting the scalar, unquote. Yet Jackendoff then gives us 8 types or kinds of value. These are affective, utility, resource, quality, prowess, esteem, normative, and personal normative or human value. My criticism of these is that they are mixed types and some are only applications of value. For example, Affective values are a kind of value, but utility and normative values are applications. He also omits two standard types of intrinsic and attributed values. Yet crucially, we still aren't talking about the inherent structures of value. Yet Jackendorf's peculiar logic of value and its apparent opacity and neglect also paradoxically reveal its character. This opacity follows from an error theory of consciousness, and similarly value as a state of consciousness. In this way, an outline of both the history and the neglect of value are vital to understanding it. And to understand the neglect of the concept of value, we can go back to its origins in ancient Greece. Karl Marx tells us that Aristotle had no concept of value, but he seems to have overstated the point. The idea of value was well known in ancient Greece. The word for value in Greek is axia. Yet Aristotle actually coined the word ethics, and Plato discussed inherent or intrinsic value. Yet neither the fact value or the is-ought distinction were known in ancient Greece, and of course the concept of value was not used as a principle of ethics. Further to the idea of a restricted notion of ethical value in ancient Greece, Elizabeth Anscombe tells us that the term moral just doesn't seem to fit in its modern sense into an account of Aristotelian ethics, unquote. Because Anscombe explains it lacks the concept of a moral sense of ought. Alistair MacIntyre took up Anscombe's work, and he informs us that, I quote, in Latin, as in ancient Greek, there is no word correctly translated by our word moral. Cicero invented moralis to translate the Greek word ethikos, meaning pertaining to character. Moving forward to 1776, Etienne Bonnot was the first economist not to agree with objective or utility value theory. He considered that both value and utility have a psychological substrate and result from individual interest. The point is that such developments reveal inadequacies prior to their discovery. Summing this up and bringing us up to the present, Charles Gray Shaw wrote in the early 20th century, I quote, "Value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy. For example, Hume's discovery of the is-ought distinction came late and is still overlooked today. And in the 19th century, science regarded as objective and value-free, now it's seen as value-laden. Also in the 19th century, Auguste Comte advocated positivist and value-free sociology in the form of social physics. This view was followed by Rudolf Carnap and the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle. And on this view, value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. These considerations reveal both a neglect and a developing understanding of value as a subjective mental state. And this neglect raises the suspicion that something important has been overlooked, that is, the subjectivity of value. Yet what is also revealed is a bias towards cognitive explanations that we need to explore further. The fact-value distinction is a means of differentiating value that is also part of the cognitive, non-cognitive classification. But the cognitive, non-cognitive classification is biased in favor of cognition and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So in my view, we should replace the non-cognitive category with the more specific affect, will and value. This results in the classification of 4 types of mental states of cognition, affect, will and value. These four states can now help us to define value and different kinds of value by contrast and comparison. Yet we should first note that analytic philosophy regards such states as separate and distinct from each other, whereas phenomenology, existentialism, and myself regard them as overlapping and interpenetrating. Examples of affect states include both feeling and, and emotion, such as pain, happiness, affection, despair, and anger. Examples of cognitive states are thought, perception, reason, knowledge, belief, and memory. With respect to the will, wanting is a directional capacity of the will that implies value, and choosing is a selective capacity of the will that also implies value. So the noted diversity of values can now be defined by their relation to the above four states. For example, desire, even sexual desire, is a mode of value with a high affect content, yet it still entails wanting. Love is thought to have a high volitional content in some religious and academic circles, and moral values often have a high cognitive content. Likewise, cognitivist theories like Kant's define value largely in terms of certain perceptions of things. John McDowell explains such in terms of favourable light or a certain perceptual capacity. Yet the fact-value distinction traditionally demarcates value by excluding it from cognitive states. But a more graduated view allows values to permeate into value-laden states because of entanglement. For example, Engelhardt held knowledge to be value-laden, and Heather Douglas adds that science is value-laden. Anthony Grayling described the world as being saturated with values, and Hilary Putnam put it in terms of the breakdown of the fact-valued dichotomy. On this integrated view, the good will has a greater cognitive content and a more refined affective content. Again, some existentialists like Shaw define value as having a high volitional content, and value need not motivate action without will or volition, that is, volition embodied by action. I have also previously calibrated the character of values by their various objects like food, God, or truth. I also argued that more refined values are produced by diminishing degrees of cognition, and that such processes of will, value, and the will for value lead to a certain sufficiency of value. Yet to explain values as subjective experiences, such sufficiencies, we need the concept of value states. And crucial to understanding value states is that they are on a spectrum with others like affect and cognition. That is, as noted earlier, values aren't just material or mental objects, but are activities and felt experiences. And we increasingly define value in terms of interior subjective features. It becomes increasingly difficult not to use the term value states that I have coined. It's significant as an indication of the neglect of value that I've never come across the term value states, and recent searches on both Google and ChatGPT produce the same results with the answer that I quote, "The term value states is not a standard or widely recognized term in psychology, philosophy, or other fields that study human emotions, attitudes, or behaviors." Some examples of value states are love, hate, dignity, self-esteem, honor, duty, resentment, and wanting. More precisely, value states necessarily contain values without which they would not exist. That is, value is a necessary constituent of value states like hate and self-esteem. Conversely, cognitive states like reason or perception typically don't contain value, and affect states like pain or pleasure can be valued but not necessarily. Yet we are using the term value states here to designate the subjectivity of value as a felt experience. And as we have seen, some value states are negative as well as positive. Our paradigm example of a positive value state is the proposed ideal of value sufficiency. This is a value state with a certain independence from supporting cognitive frameworks. And to take this analysis of value, value states, and value sufficiency further, we can now look to intrinsic values. This is the case because all sufficient values, like magnanimity and love, have intrinsic value, and that sufficient values are intrinsic values that are affirmed as such by a will to value. But not all intrinsic values have significant levels of value sufficiency, because intrinsic values can be trivial. For example, my love of my dog is of intrinsic value, but it is of less value than my love for my wife. And both the significance of sufficient value and the idea of a neglect of value become apparent in the analysis of intrinsic value below. To begin with, intrinsic values are usually contrasted to attributed or instrumental values. Intrinsic values are valuable due to their own inherent qualities. Instrumental values are attributed with value as means towards some other end. To illustrate the idea of intrinsic value, consider different ways in which values are considered to be intrinsic. Money is widely accepted as tokens without intrinsic value, except by misers, children, and Aristotle. Valuables like gold are thought to have intrinsic value, but only in an economic context. Valuables are only valuable for what they appropriate, like houses or cars. But physical objects are only valuable for the satisfactions that they bring. So on this view, ultimately only mental states and conscious beings can have intrinsic value. People talk about things like forests having intrinsic value, but what does this mean? In a social view, or in a supposedly grander scheme of things, such seem to have intrinsic value. We may even have to believe that they have value in order to preserve meaning in the world. But strictly speaking, such things don't have meaning in themselves. Conversely, truth, beauty, and knowledge are traditional candidates of intrinsic value. William Frank Kenner names a long list of intrinsic values, including life, virtue, and consciousness. And the intrinsic value of certain principles, actions, or objects is held by many prominent philosophers. These include Aristotle, G.E. Moore, Robert Nozick, Ronald Dworkin, and Derek Parfit. Parfit claims that things like books and rational activity can have intrinsic value, and Dworkin tells us that paintings and great trees have intrinsic value. In my view, the belief that such abstract or material objects can have intrinsic value is hugely mistaken. Yet it's certain that the disagreement between subjectivists like Perry and Mackie and objectivists like Parfit and Dworkin constitute a schism that indicates a radical misunderstanding of the nature of value. The objectivist error is trying to explain value with the properties of the object rather than with those of the agent. Moore and Nozick, for example, define intrinsic value by means of their organic unity or internal coherence. I define intrinsic value by means of its reflective capacity that assigns value to itself. Yet I discuss intrinsic value in much more detail in an earlier podcast, number 17. But my objective here is only to elucidate value, intrinsic value, and their neglect. It isn't to argue against the idea of objective value. Yet my central point is that the neglect and misunderstanding of value stems from a neglect of subjectivity. And this is best redressed by explaining the foundations of value in subjectivity and consciousness. And consciousness is well explained by phenomenology, which connects value and consciousness. Sartre writes, for instance, that the being of the self is value, and he is thereby able to say that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. What we are saying here is that value and consciousness are coexistent. This is explained with a close identification between consciousness, value, and choice as selection. For example, Sartre writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. That is, elimination and selection presuppose disfavour and preference as expressions of value. Yet Sartre writes, choice isn't just preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. And again, selection isn't just deliberated choice, but selection as part of an underlying structure. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis of choice, tracing it back to its ontological foundation. This is because his ultra-phenomenological method prevents him from employing mental graduations. That is, from the unconscious, the preconscious, immediate consciousness to reflective consciousness. Yet we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. And we can continue to say that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential to epistemic contrasts and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen, it needs a contrast. Such contrasts are at the foundations of value and consciousness. But at least two objections can be made to this kind of explanation of incipient values. One, they are not the values we need in motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. And two, values also emerge from social and biological sources without selection and choice. In response to the exception of biological values, such must be experienced in consciousness in order to be values. That is, an automatic propensity to action is not a value. Such are only latent or potential values. They only become values on selection as preferences of mental states. For example, animals express preferences in procreation, nourishment, and survival behaviours. So animals are conscious creatures which can have values but not moral values. In response to explaining values of motivation, morals or meaning, the above is an account of incipient values, and such an account of the origins of value includes the potential for the development of more substantive values. And Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl offer such an account of time that provides more substantive values. Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. That consciousness is also moving through time as well as through the diversity in space. and substantive values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of experience. The discussion so far has defined value in terms of its different types: value states, intrinsic value, subjectivity, consciousness, selection, choice, graduation, and its neglect. We have also noted cognitivist, realist, and volitional theories of value, but we have omitted many others. One such is a cost theory that explains value in terms of cost or price that is paid. Another is a desire-based theory that supposes that value must be antecedently desired. Robert Nozick has a theory of value that cites one of the properties of value as possibility. And possibility marks out the space that thought, experience, and aspiration can enter into. But possibility is a precondition of many human activities, not only value. For Sartre, value is a lack or absence, which might simply be describing what we do not have. Yet it accords with his negative appraisal of consciousness that brings nothingness into the world. And it also accords with a cost theory, as well as explaining a certain tension that we find in value. But it fails to account for sufficiencies of value like magnanimity, courage, and love. Sartre also regards human consciousness as a useless passion, vainly seeking the permanence of physicality. But there's an alternative response to consciousness seeking the permanence of physicality. That is, replace the permanence of physicality with a more appropriate sufficiency of value. Yet we haven't had time to explain or discuss this sufficiency of value. Also, despite a general neglect of explicit analyses of value, we haven't had time to include other studies. For example, E.W. Hall, Riziri Frondizi, and Maurice Mendelbaum have all written works of the same title, What is Value? Yet Hall's work is largely a methodological analysis of the tools by which value is examined. And the titles What is Value rather than What are Values reflect a conceptualist approach, even though Mandelbaum's approach is more phenomenological. We also haven't deeply discussed the cognitive issue of whether values must always involve mental objects. Yet, as noted in phenomenology, the question of mental objects can be discussed in terms of intentionality. The concept of intentionality was introduced by Franz Brentano, who made it a feature of all mental states. But others claim that states like pain and pleasure, or indeed value, need not intend towards objects. Yet it can be argued that values always value something, hence values involve intentionality. However, values can be compared to an ocean current as well as a river, having direction as well as an objective. This brings intentionality to our notice as having an interior quality as well as an external object, and this enables intentionality to be applied to non-cognitive states and values as well as cognitive states. Husserl and Heidegger also preferred to use the term directedness rather than intentionality, and Tim Crane notes Brentano's student Twardowski's attention to the content of intentionality, although we don't have time here to discuss this aspect of value either. Yet the idea of qualified intentionality leads to a definition of value in terms of its internal structures. That is, a fillip of affirmation in addition to intentionality is essential to the character and existence of value. This is the case either for the unreflected values of animals or the reflective values of humans. Yet in humans, that reflective affirmation enables moral or other kinds of value. and then many other factors will affect the type and quality of that value. And there's the difficulty of explaining experiential aspects of value, like feeling and preference, with theoretical accounts. These can only be approached with imagination and empathy for known human situations and experiences. Such methods appreciate the role of value in the experience of morals, meaning, purpose, aesthetics, and religion. In religion, for example, God represents the believer's highest value together with a whole world of other values. Love is a mode of value, with different kinds of love presenting different kinds of value. And a meaningful life is a worthwhile and valuable life lit up by values. I call explaining qualitative aspects of value the very hard problem, like Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. Yet we can also compare the qualia of value and consciousness. Daniel Dennett expectedly denies both. Qualia are the feelings and experiences of the introspectively accessible phenomenal aspects of our mental lives. In this way, qualia can be said to help to explain the experiential and qualitative aspects of value. Yet value also has a transcendent aspect of reaching for something beyond what already exists. And at this point we are groping at the indefinability of truth, the goodwill, and human possibility. With that conclusion, we could round up with what we have not discussed as much as what we have discussed. One issue that we haven't discussed is whether values are always motivational or not, and must values be reflective, or can they be pre-reflective, as in the unconscious or animals? This is about the scope of value. This is a feature that we haven't had time to expand or make explicit. That is, from its origins in consciousness to its various expressions in the world, even in cognitive faculties. By comparison, our view of science or mathematics must go beyond our current understanding of them. That is, we believe that mathematics or whatever is a coherent system able to explain future problems. And our view of value must similarly include our widest context of explaining human life, including the resolution of evaluative problems of life like morals, meaning and purpose. Yet we have explained value as a fundamental constituent of consciousness. Another fundamental constituent, that is cognition, affect, will and value, enabled us to make comparisons and contrasts. And this account not only emphasized the neglect of subjectivity in value, but also its interiority. This included features like quality, selection, preference, choice, graduation, and intrinsic value. And finally, we have been discussing value because of its significance in a value perspective of human life. That is, value is proposed as a principle of life, as the will to value, leading to a sufficiency of value. I'm also presenting a series on consciousness as a foundation of these claims. But let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like meetup.com or Zoom.